They know I'm a tourist, so the moment I'm on there's something about me wherever I go.
Let's go.
Screams American tourist. Not the luggage.
I think Joanne sit over there.
Okay, so we're ready to start. And if you're here for class, have a seat, please. People watching have no idea that there are people standing in the Grossberg Baumgart Chapel. So, welcome to part 3 of our class. And in our first class, we talked about just the concepts of God as they appear in the Bible, and how the Bible and the Torah especially just assume that God exists rather than helping us to figure out how we know that God exists. And then the Torah and the Bible contain many examples of different aspects of God's character, so to speak. God as warrior, creator, lawgiver, etc. Last week we talked specifically then about the disability concept as it possibly relates to God through Psalm 23. Psalm 23 being the popular psalm, a psalm that is well known, that is most associated with funerals and mourning, and a sense of walking through the valley of shadow of death, I will fear no evil. But what is that rod and staff of God that comforts us? And suggesting through, again, through Dr. Ora Horn-Prauser's teaching, that possibly the word for rod, mishenet, is really a cane. And if it is a cane, then that possibly shifts the way that we then picture God in that psalm, rather than a shepherd, perhaps as an older man who needs a cane because that man is unsteady on his feet. Or it could be a younger man who had suffered some kind of physical injury that required some kind of support. And so then what that does to help us, how is that comforting? Seeing when we're talking to a God, to the God, who would be essentially handicapped in some way. And so we talked about that last time. What I wanted to talk about tonight then is intellectual disabilities and how we can, whether we can dare to picture God having an intellectual disability, and why we would do that, and how that could possibly help us understand differently very troubling passages in the Torah and the Bible. So trust me, we'll get through those topics, and though some might look skeptical about that, let's see how it goes. I'm not suggesting in this class that we have to imagine God with disabilities. I am not suggesting that we have to especially imagine God with an intellectual disability. What I'm saying is that as someone who is an advocate for people with disabilities, who tries to understand what people with disabilities go through, that perhaps this opens doors for our just our sense of theology and our sense of compassion that we're supposed to have to our fellow human being, and like I said, helps us possibly understand in a different way troubling passages. So I want to start by defining some terms, because even though I know what intellectual disabilities are, it's possible that we might not understand that. And what I'm talking about specifically, So my brother, for example, has an intellectual and a developmental disability. So he needs to live in a group home, which the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania pays for. And the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania used to pay for his living at a private institution, a full-time institution called the Woods Schools, which was in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, about 20 years ago, decided not to pay exorbitant tuition and living expense for all Pennsylvania residents at living situations like that, and shifted to group homes where there are about 6 to 8 adults, not co-ed, and of similar intellectual developmental disabilities. There always are support staff there. My brother cannot live on his own, needs constant support, cannot take public transportation on his own, works in a sheltered workshop, which means that there is the state heavily subsidizes some kind of work environment with companies that my brother essentially does menial tasks, whether it is to put 20 of some object into a bag or whether it is to stuff envelopes, something like that. We might be familiar with this, that when Shaare Tefila was in its old neighborhood in White Oak, there is a place down New Hampshire Avenue called CHI Centers. That's essentially what my brother works in. That's a sheltered workshop also, and you might see buses or small minivans taking adults to and from the CHI centers. There was a time, I think, that the shul contracted with CHI centers to do our mailings for us. So just for a couple of years, I think. So anyway, that's what my brother gets, a very below minimum wage salary, but he's happy with his money that he gets every week, because he puts it right into the vending machine to get his candy and soda. He also gets SSI, Social Security insurance, disability insurance. And so when there are many disability advocates who are pushing for people who are higher functioning than my brother to be able to get out of a group home setting, to be more independent, and to have minimum wage jobs. All that does not apply to my brother because he is lower functioning than that. So I'm not talking about God having such an intellectual or developmental disability. I am talking about those who are much more higher functioning than that, what is called the people who are on the autism spectrum. So it used to be years ago that there was something called Asperger's syndrome. Apparently that is no longer a diagnosis that is accepted. Anybody who would have been diagnosed as Asperger's is now more broadly on the autism spectrum, which means, so this is off the internet for Wikipedia. Autism is a developmental disorder characterized by troubles with social interaction and communication, and by restricted and repetitive behavior. Parents usually notice signs in the first 2 or 3 years of their child's life. These signs often develop gradually, though some children with autism reach their developmental milestones at a normal pace and then worsen. There's a whole spectrum of autism, and so troubles with social interaction is common to all those who are diagnosed with autism. That could be simply when it's mainly characterized by social cues, social skills. So in other words, things that we take for granted in having a conversation with someone, like I'm looking at Saul Cohen right now, eye to eye, someone on the autism spectrum, if they're having a conversation with you, Saul, would be looking over there. Okay? And that it takes a lot of training and social skills therapists with working with people with autism to try to train them to look at someone directly in the eye when they're talking to them. That's one example. Other things that we do that are body language, like if we there are signals that we do to say that we're done having a conversation with somebody. Someone on the autism spectrum doesn't read that, has no idea that body language is a language. And so if for example, I'm picking on Saul because he's sitting on the front row for those watching at home. Let's say I'm having a conversation with Saul and I want to signal that I'm done. I'll start moving away, perhaps, taking a step back. Or maybe I'll look at Marlene over there, which will give the signal also that I'm ready to move on. And it's like at Kiddush, right? There's so many people that I need to talk to at Kiddush that hopefully people understand that I'm having a conversation, I'm looking you in the eye, but then somebody else is either tapping me on the arm or I see something happening over there that so most people get the signal, but people on the autism spectrum don't get the signal and will keep on talking as I even walk away from them and turn my back to them. And they don't see that that is unusual or wrong in any way. So that's just one example, body language, that is a characteristic of not being able to read body language is a characteristic of people who are on the autism spectrum. There's also the repetitive behavior, and that's those who would be, I guess, more severe on the autism spectrum. There's just the sense that you just have to do something and do that behavior several times in a row before you can move on to the next thing. I'm rocking back and forth now. There are some people who are on the autism spectrum who just, when they're sitting, just rock back and forth incessantly. And they may not recognize that they're doing it, but they do it, and it's just one characteristic. I'm not saying that now that I list these characteristics that we can go out and diagnose people. I'm just saying that these are just things. Repetitive behavior, not being able to read body language, lack of social interaction or social skills. Another element, so globally, autism is estimated to affect 24.8 million people. That was as of 2015, 24.8. So let's say 25 million people in the world are diagnosed with some degree of autism. That's a lot. Okay, and children with high-functioning autism suffer from more intense and frequent loneliness compared to non-autistic peers, despite the common belief that children with autism prefer to be alone. Making and maintaining friendships often proves to be difficult for those with autism. For them, the quality of friendships, not the number of friends, predicts how lonely they feel. Functional friendships, such as those resulting in invitations to parties, may affect the quality of life more deeply. Okay? So we have to keep that in mind, a sense of loneliness. So some of these repetitive behaviors that are characteristic of people with autism: stereotype behaviors, such repetitive movements such as hand flapping, head rolling, or body rocking. Compulsive behaviors, time-consuming behaviors intended to reduce anxiety that an individual feels compelled to perform repeatedly or according to rigid rules, such as placing objects in a specific order, checking things, or hand washing. Sometimes these are called obsessive-compulsive behaviors. There is such a thing as an obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD, and this could be a characteristic of people with autism, but there are people who are otherwise not autistic who do have obsessive-compulsive behaviors. Okay, but obsessive-compulsive behaviors are more common among people on the autism spectrum. So again, time-consuming behaviors, compelled to perform repeatedly or according to rigid rules, such as placing objects in a specific order, checking things, or hand washing. Sameness, resistance to change, for example, insisting that the furniture not be moved or refusing to be interrupted. Okay, so you have to be in the same routine. You have to sit at the same place at the dining room table. Perhaps you have to have the same meal for dinner every night. You have to cut your food in a particular way, the same way all the time. And if it's not cut that way, or if you're forced to sit at a different place at the table, that could set you off. And I've seen that in my brother, and I've seen that in others as well. So, if something has been moved in the room, furniture has been moved, or something like that. Especially imagine I grew up moving around every couple of years. Imagine what how that affected my brother, or how that would affect people on the autism spectrum. It's taking them out of their routine and is very anxiety producing. There's ritualistic behavior, unvarying pattern of daily activities, such as unchanging menu or a dressing ritual. This is closely associated with sameness, and an independent validation has suggested combining the two factors. In other words, and just different psychologists trying to specifically define these behaviors. Sameness or ritualistic behavior, basically the same thing. Restricted interests. Interests or fixations that are abnormal in theme or intensity of focus, such as preoccupation with a single television program, toy, or game. Okay?
John,
yes?
are you familiar with the Big Bang Theory?
The TV show?
Yeah.
Yes, they say Sheldon Cooper could be the character Sheldon Cooper. Absolutely, in some way, could be considered on the autism spectrum. Now, another element of autism, which isn't mentioned here, is it could be highly intelligent people. And they could be more intelligent than the average person, but yet have the social skills lacking in social skills, could have the OCD element, and so perhaps Sheldon Cooper 10 years ago might have been diagnosed, the character on Big Bang Theory could have been diagnosed as Asperger's. Now it would be diagnosed as on the autism spectrum. Barbara.
My daughter works over at one of the high schools here, and she runs a program where it's called the Bridge Program, and all the children, for the most part, they are on this autism spectrum, but they're high intelligent, and they're
different counties. So Barbara's talking about her daughter who works for Montgomery County. Different counties and different states have different ways in which they provide services to people who need what's called an IEP, an individual education program. And so I don't want to get into specifics, Barbara, of different kinds of programs. Yes.
But it's among the
Yes.
high achievers.
Yes.
I mean, she has supervises classes with there's like 100 kids. Total.
Right. So yes. So the spectrum itself is broad, and certainly on the high functioning end, there's still some of these repetitive behaviors that are exhibited. There's still the social skills that need to be worked on. But there's a higher intelligence or aspects of intelligence that are more refined and exceptional than in the average person. So, for example, the movie Rain Man that came out about 20 years ago, that person in Rain Man is more like my brother. So a little bit higher functioning than my brother. He's able to communicate well. I'm not sure that the Dustin Hoffman character of that movie was able to read. My brother is not able to read. He knows the letters of the alphabet. He can write if you tell him what letters to put in order. But my brother, if you ask him what day of the week March 3rd will be on, my brother can tell you that. I have no idea how. So he's not looking at a calendar. He just knows in his head that March 3rd is going to be, I don't know what day of the week March 3rd is this year, but whatever it is, my brother knows. So he could tell you for this year. He can't tell you for next year, but he can tell you for this year. So Rain Man, you drop a box of toothpicks, he could tell you, he told you in the movie how many toothpicks were in that box. And so therefore the Tom Cruise character took advantage of him in Las Vegas so that he could read the cards and win at blackjack or poker all the time. So yes, and so Rain Man, the Dustin Hoffman character, had no idea what he was doing, but he saw all the numbers and the cards, and he was able to do that. So used to be called Idiot Savant. It's just called Savant, being able to have that skill. Other people, perhaps on the autism spectrum, are highly musically talented and are able to hear a piece of music and play it on whatever instrument just like that. They can't necessarily compose music on their own, but they can play by ear. So, or mathematical skills like the Sheldon Cooper character, who's like a world-class physicist.
There's another TV show called The New Doctor.
Oh, yes, The Good Doctor.
The Good Doctor.
The Good Doctor, that's right. Somebody also like that, who I saw the pilot episode of it. I didn't think it was such a well-done show as far as a TV show, but yes, it portrayed that kind of character, this doctor who otherwise socially challenged and on the autism spectrum, but the show portrayed him looking at a body and what is wrong with it and picturing the pages from the anatomy textbook that showed exactly what was going on. So yes, so I think that's a fair portrayal, and people in the disability world and the disability advocacy world were talking about that TV show as well. So I just want us to, yes, Peggy.
Well, the one thing that is scary is a lot of these children are normal up till about 1.5 or 2 years old.
Right.
And then all of a sudden this shows up.
Yes. Yeah, so right. So Peggy's pointing out what this article also pointed out, that symptoms start exhibiting themselves in children around 1.5, 2 years old. We don't know the cause. We don't know the cause yet. Some people think that certain vaccines cause this, and that's not the case. But there are those who would argue that, I don't know, the DPT vaccine or some vaccine like that some people refuse to take that vaccine, have their child be vaccinated with that because they think it might cause that. We really don't know. It's some genetic defect and don't know what causes it. And again, I'm not an expert on all of this, just by the way, just throwing that out there for people who are watching me. I'm not an expert on this, but I do understand that it's not an injury or a virus that causes it. There's some kind of genetic mutation. And so I just want us to focus on these symptoms of what people on who are diagnosed as being on the spectrum exhibit. The repetitive behavior, the need for things to be in a particular place and done in a particular way, a sense of loneliness, that it's hard to make friends. And just want us to think about that in terms of God and I'm going to share with you a couple of scenes from the Torah that in light of these characteristics and definitions might shed light on these events in a new way. So I just want to also share this one thought from a woman named Julia Bascom, This came from a webinar that I took 2 weeks after the class that I took at the rabbinic conference with Dr. Ora Horn-Prauser. There's a rabbi, colleague of mine, who was just ordained last May, who, Ruti Regan is her name, and she is diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum, and she's the scholar for Matan, which is a educational organization for children, a Jewish educational organization for children, has a website, matanforkids.org. So she gave a webinar on created in God's image. So it's not imagining God with a disability, but being more compassionate to people who have disabilities. So this woman named Julia Bascom says that these characteristics of being on the spectrum, which she has, it's not anything recognized on the continuum of normal. It's that the experience is so rich. It's textured, vibrant, and layered. It exudes joy. It's a hug machine for my brain. It makes my heart pump faster and my mouth twitch back into a smile every few minutes. I feel like I'm sparkling. Every inch of me is totally engaged in and powered up by the obsession. Things are clear, it's beautiful, it's perfect. So we might be taken aback by seeing someone who is on the autism spectrum exhibiting these behaviors, think that we have to intervene in some way. We're uncomfortable because it's not normal behavior, but from someone who exhibits those behaviors, she's able to communicate how good it makes her feel when she does it, and it's every inch of me is totally engaged in and powered up by the obsession. So it's just interesting to hear from the other side what it feels like to be part of that behavior. So with that in mind, understanding this definition of what it means to be on the autism spectrum, I want to share a couple of scenes from the Torah and the Bible that that perhaps could be similar. So in chapter 21 of the book of Leviticus, we're told about the characteristics that a Kohen has to exhibit in order to be able to work as a Kohen in the Mishkan, in the portable sanctuary. Starting with verse 16 in chapter 21 of Leviticus, the Lord spoke further to Moses, "Speak to Aaron and say, no man of your offspring throughout the ages who has a defect shall be qualified to offer the food of his God. No one at all who has a defect shall be qualified. No man who is blind, lame, has a limb too short or too long, broken leg or broken arm, who is hunchback or a dwarf, who has a growth in his eye, has a boil scar or scurvy. No man among the offspring of Aaron the priest who has a defect shall be qualified to offer the Lord's gift. Having a defect, he shall not be qualified to offer the food of his God. He may eat of the food of his God, of the most holy as well as of the holy, but he shall not enter behind the curtain or come near the altar, for he has a defect. He shall not profane these places sacred to me, for I, the Lord, have sanctified them." So when we read that, how did we used to understand that passage? What is our immediate reaction to that? That anybody with any kind of defect, blind, lame, limb too short, all physical things, but why?
Same with cattle.
And you're saying they can't be called to the...
They can't work. They're saying anybody with this cannot, no man among the offspring of Aaron the priest who has such a defect shall be qualified to offer the Lord's gift. Means that
You mean
they can't
physical
work. Any one of these physical defects.
I mean, there was a synagogue in Williamsburg where my husband's family
Yes.
never married and had children, and they would not give them an aliyah
Right.
because they did not fulfill their obligation to God, the Lord. And
Right.
is this physical work or is this
Physical.
religious work?
Well, that's a question. The physical work of being a Kohen was religious work. And so, yes, there were physical things that a Kohen had to do in order to be a Kohen. Not just to dress the part, but to offer the sacrifice. So there's physical labor of actually slaughtering the animal and cutting the animal into pieces and offering it on the altar. There's offering incense, which is less physical. It's not as heavy, but there's work involved in preparing all of the items that would be, for lack of a more technical term, smushed together to become incense and then lit as incense. So it's less physical than offering a cow or an ox or a sheep or a goat. And then there's also offering the meal offering. That's not too much work to do. You can even do that with one hand. Holding the Torah, touching the Torah, it's not part of the Kohen's job. The Kohen had nothing to do with reading the Torah. Only Moses read the Torah, and later on, kings of Israel read the Torah. Kohen did not read the Torah publicly. We're talking about in the Mishkan is only sacrifices. So again, why our immediate reaction when we read these, anybody with such a physical defect?
You cannot be perfect to do God's work.
So one idea is that you have to be perfect in order to do God's work, right? And so yes, and as you said before, Saul, the same thing about animals. Animals can't have a blemish on it. They have to be perfect in order to be offered, and that's related today to how we eat kosher animals. So an animal that is kosherly slaughtered still has to be inspected, the insides, especially the lungs, and if they don't, and only if the lungs. So we all mostly we are glot kosher, which means smooth kosher, which means that the lungs have no blemishes on them. So there is that sense if animals have to be perfect, then the people working in the temple have to be perfect too.
Animals have to be perfect because they might contaminate you if you eat them, you know. But this is purely on the surface, unless, leopards I could see, maybe, somebody who had a contagious disease.
Right.
But this is...
So these are all physical deformities, and it's not about, has nothing to do with contagion or anything sanitary or health related. Some people think that the laws of purity and impurity in the Torah, like the portions Tazria and Mitzorah about the rashes, and what's translated as leprosy, all those things deal with contagious diseases. It has nothing to do with that. It's all about unusual things that happen.
But this is only to the Kohen.
With this specifically, it's only a Kohen. So in other words, an Israelite who needs to offer a sacrifice for having done something wrong, so like a guilt offering, sin offering, or an offering of well-being because something good happened in their lives. If such a person had such a defect, not a problem for them to bring it, right? And to eat of it, depending what it is. Some sacrifices could only be consumed totally on the altar. Others could be only eaten by the Kohanim and the Kohen's family. And others could be eaten by everybody. Depends what the sacrifice was. So no, this is not about a person offering a sacrifice. It's about the Kohen who's working in the Mishkan and later in the temple. So the workers who are God's representatives on earth have to be perfect without defect. What Dr. Ora Horn-Prauser suggests is that possibly this relates to some of these characteristics of being on the spectrum, needing things to be in a particular way, a certain way, this way and nothing else. It has to be this way. So possibly she is suggesting that this reflects a God that is on the spectrum, that needs things to be done perfectly. And anything that would be done imperfectly, somebody limping by offering the sacrifice, somebody blind who would then walk in a different way to the altar, someone who is hunchback, anybody who looks different, it's out of routine and therefore possibly could represent this autistic behavior. There's also, so this is not the only example I'm giving you. If this was the only example that Dr. Prauser would give, then the argument is shot. Okay? Example number one. Example number two is back in the portion Shmini. So in that portion, we're told that it is the 8th day of the consecration ceremony. So there's 7 days of the consecration of the Kohanim who are working in the Mishkan. And on the 8th day, the regular sacrificial system was going to begin. And so then, anybody remember what happened? Yeah, right. Right. So Aaron's 2 sons, Nadav and Avihu. So chapter 10 of Leviticus. Now Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu, each took his fire pan, put fire in it, and laid incense on it, and they offered before the Lord alien fire, which God had not commanded them. And fire came forth from the Lord and consumed them. Thus they died at the instance of the Lord. Then Moses said to Aaron, "This is what the Lord meant when he said, 'Through those near to me I show myself holy and gain glory before all the people.'" And Aaron was silent. Now again, rabbis over the centuries, commentators, rabbis of the Midrash, try to explain what happened to Nadav and Avihu, and what was it about that alien fire that would justify God striking Nadav and Avihu down. What did they do so wrong? What was so alien about this fire that they brought that warranted them being struck down by God? So commentators suggest things like Nadav and Avihu trying to be arrogant, and so look at us, we get to work, who cares about the rules, we're going to offer what we want to offer, yay, and then poof, they're struck down. There goes your arrogance, Nadav and Avihu. And many other, and you can look on the page in the Eitz Chaim, you can look in the older Hertz Chumash, and it's lengthy commentary on the page. So, for example, you see below the line here is more commentary than on top with the text itself, all trying to explain away what happens here. But what if we understand, again, a God who is compulsive, a God who wants things done in an exact way and has to rely on human beings to do it perfectly, and then here comes Nadav and Avihu to set God off. I want this sacrifice done this way, and you are doing it that way. Poof, get out of here. Okay, example number 2. Okay, so we have the characteristics of a Kohen. We have Nadav and Avihu. We have the Haftarah for Shmini is another story about how the ark had been captured by the Philistines, and David, before he became king, he was a general in the Israelite army, went to capture the ark, recapture it, and bring it back. And so he was able to do that. And they loaded the ark of God onto a new cart and conveyed it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. And Abinadab's sons Uzzah and Achio guided the new cart. They conveyed it from Abinadab's house on the hill, Uzzah walking alongside the ark of God, and Achio walking in front of the ark. Meanwhile, David and all the house of Israel danced before the Lord to the sound of all kinds of cypress wood instruments with lyres, harps, timbrels, sistrums, and cymbals. What does the Torah say about about carrying the ark? Are there rules about carrying the ark?
There were certain Levites.
All the Levitical families were in charge of constructing, breaking down, transporting the Mishkan throughout the desert. Okay, and until the temple was built in Jerusalem, right? Each Levitical family had their job to do, and it's only that family that could do their job. So you can't have a substitute Levi from one family do the job of the other family. It has to, so one family's in charge of all the boards, one family's in charge of all the curtains, one family's in charge of carrying the ark itself. Okay, so we have to remember that. Now the house of Avinadav is not a Levitical family. Okay, they just provided the cart to put the ark on. Okay, now, when they came to the threshing floor of Nachon, Uzzah reached out for the ark of God and grasped it, for the oxen had stumbled. The Lord was incensed at Uzzah, and God struck him down on the spot for his indiscretion, and he died there beside the ark of God. David was distressed because the Lord had inflicted a breach upon Uzzah, and that place was named Peretz Uzzah, as it is still called today. So, Nadav and Avihu, struck down by God for bringing an alien fire, strange fire, out of order. Uzzah, good intentions. The ark, because the oxen had stumbled, the ark was precarious on the cart. Uzzah, not a Levi, says, I'm going to make sure the ark doesn't tumble. God strikes him down. We don't know why God struck him. It's the narrator explaining that the Lord was incensed at Uzzah. But if God has a particular way that God wants things to be done, then that could explain, that sounds like autism spectrum behavior. What about chapter 2 of Genesis, chapters 2 and 3? Just a second. Okay. So chapter 2 of Genesis, Adam and Eve are created. Again, they're talked about being created again. And the Garden of Eden is created, and Adam and Eve are put in the garden. And verse 15 of chapter 2, the Lord God took the man and placed him in the Garden of Eden to till it and tend it. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden you are free to eat. But as for the tree of knowledge of good and bad, you must not eat of it, for as soon as you eat of it, you shall die. Why?
He wanted control.
Okay, yes, whatever the reason, we have no idea. Why did God create a tree that Adam and Eve were not allowed to touch and to eat from? Why put Adam and Eve in a garden in a situation that you know, because they're human, they're going to fail? Okay, so this is a original sin question, whatever. It's a story that has been commented on and serve as a basis for Christian thought.
They were so innocent, and if they got knowledge, they would see that there's a lot of evil in the world, and that would change their innocence.
Right, so yes, so as Peggy's explaining, absolutely, they're innocent, they eat of the tree of knowledge, they'll be their eyes wide open, whatever it is, of course.
I mean, it doesn't mean that God doesn't want people to have knowledge of other things, but maybe
right.
This tree is only evil.
So this story is one of many stories in Genesis which explain the origin of things. Like, why do snakes slither on the ground? Because as punishment for the snake tempting Eve to eat of the fruit. Because that snake there had legs. Snakes don't have legs anymore. So that's it. Why do women have pain in childbirth? Because of this. Why do men have to work for a living? Because of this story. Why do people die? Because of this story. That's called etiology, etiology, explaining the origin of things. So which came first? The story or the fact that people are this way? The people are this way, then you write a story as to why they are this way, right? All mythologies of all peoples in the world contain creation myths that explain certain things about the origin of things. So this story explained that the story of the Garden of Eden explained lots of things about the origin of good and evil and man's inhumanity to man, right? You got the story of Cain and Abel also. So why is there a tree that you're not supposed to touch? Perhaps God has certain things that only that you're supposed to leave alone. And anybody, like I said, on the autism spectrum, if you touch something that belongs to someone who is autistic, they can tell that it has been touched. And they get very angry, and it could set them off, and will take a long time to calm them down afterwards. So perhaps this is another example of God exhibiting autistic-like behavior. There is also a sense that people who are on the spectrum are sometimes difficult to reach emotionally and with communication. So I'm not necessarily talking about the people who are higher functioning on the autism spectrum, but even them, they can't understand certain emotional characteristics, right? It's kind of hard. If we think of Sheldon Cooper on the Big Bang Theory, again, not to explain autism by Rain Man, the movie, and the Big Bang Theory, or this new TV show, The Good Doctor, but there are just simple ways of being able to connect to what I'm talking about. So Sheldon Cooper on the Big Bang Theory has very difficult time connecting to emotion, right? And so even though he has a girlfriend, or he's now married, I don't know. I don't follow the series, but what? But I don't remember if they're married yet. Are they gay? They're engaged? I haven't seen. I know, but I don't watch episode after episode in a row. Whatever's on at 9:30 at night on TNT or TBS, whatever it is. So it goes out of order. But whatever. He has a girlfriend, whatever. What? Amy something Fowler, whatever it is, right? She's Jewish, Mayim Bialik, right? Anyway, so how hard it is, physical connection. Right? Sheldon doesn't like to hug and doesn't think that hugging is necessary. Again, that's a part of the social skills element of people on the spectrum. And so the idea then, not just for the person who exhibits the behavior, but also for others who are trying to establish a relationship with that person, that is very difficult to do so. Right? So, in other words, all the characters in Big Bang Theory know how to cope with Sheldon Cooper, but don't always know how to connect with him in the best way. Right? So, in other words, they know what will set him off and will try not to set him off. And try to provide circumstances so that he will be the most comfortable, the most engaging, and the most normal as possible, right? Because they know if something untoward happens, whoa, they never hear the end of it, okay? And that's what all the shows are based on, what's going to set Sheldon off, okay? Now, by extension, then, if we accept, I just gave you 3 examples of what could be several examples of possibly God exhibiting autism spectrum behavior. And so if God is exhibiting that behavior then how much, that's number one. Number two, if our function as religious human beings is trying to connect to God and to have God listen to our prayers, as number two, then number three, if God exhibits autism spectrum behavior, how much more difficult is it for us then to connect to God? Because we might expect God to be like us, and that is, most of us are normal or typical behavior. So if we expect God to be typical behavior, then perhaps the way that we're talking to God, and God is not, God is on the spectrum, then perhaps we're talking to God in the wrong way. And that we're approaching God in the wrong way. And that perhaps we need to try to get into the mind, so to speak, of someone who's on the autism spectrum, and by extension, apply that to try to get into the mind of God in a way that someone on the spectrum can understand and appreciate. So, for example, there's Psalm 42, which partly reflects the idea of how difficult it is to connect to God. So Psalm 42, it's one of the psalms that our prayer book gives as a possibility to share in a house of mourning. So if you're on page 95 in the Siddur, if you have it in front of you, but I'm going to read it. But so there's this section from 93 to 99 in the Siddur of options to say in a house of mourning. So when, at the conclusion of the service, there's an extra psalm that's added in the house of mourning for an extra Kaddish for the mourner to recite. Normally it's Psalm 49. That's the traditional one. But our prayer book and others offer different ones because Psalm 49 is very harsh. Psalm 49 is about we all die. So what's the point of complaining? That's not exactly the comforting message that a mourner wants to hear. And so that's why our prayer book and other editions of prayer books offer other psalms that are comforting. Okay, like Psalm 90, page 95, Psalm 42, which reflects just this frustration of being able to connect with God. So it's Psalm 42. Like a gazelle searching for a flowing stream, so do I long for you, O God. How my soul thirsts for the living God, for the time that I can stand in God's presence. Day and night I am sustained only by my tears, as day after day I am asked, where is your God? Right, so in other words, you're crying. People might say, what are you crying for? Where's God? Don't you have a connection to God? I pour out my soul as I recollect. Once I was part of the surging crowd, drawn along to God's house, amidst sounds of song and thanksgiving, a festive throng. Why then, my soul, are you so anguished? Why do you tremble within me? Have faith in God's deliverance. I will yet again sing praises for God's saving presence. So it sounds like he's exhibiting doubt now. Something happened. He used to be part of the celebratory crowd. Something happened. He can't celebrate anymore. With my spirit brought low, I remember the past, your miracles at Mount Sinai and the Jordan Valley. Wave upon wave has been roused by your thunder, yet your breakers and billows cannot overwhelm me. If only Adonai would show me his love by day, then at night I could sing, praising God who gives me life. To God, my rock, I still cry, why have you forgotten me? Why must I walk in darkness, oppressed by my grief? I am pierced to the bone, tormented by my doubts, as I question all day long, where is your God? Do not be undone, my soul, by the anguish we share. Do not be unnerved by our trembling. Have faith in God's deliverance. I shall yet have occasion to exalt my Redeemer, my God. So maybe it's not just about feeling comfortable in God's presence again. Maybe it's a sense of not being able to connect with God anymore. And perhaps it could be a sense like, how can I reach God? I was able to reach God when I was part of that throng, maybe doing the sacrifices that we knew God liked because it was done in a certain way. But maybe as I'm not part of the throng, I don't know how to connect to God. So maybe that could be, by extension, a psalm that could reflect this, how difficult it is not just that it's difficult to connect to an abstract God, but maybe the sense also God having autism spectrum behavior could highlight the sense of how difficult it is to connect. So again, let me just conclude with this point, and I can open it up for questions and discussion by saying this again. What I want to get across is that as someone who's an advocate in the disability community, the main idea is that we need to show compassion to everybody in the world. And that no matter how we are created in God's image. And we are commanded to try to have some kind of connection, an emotional connection with everybody. People who are on the autism spectrum, and I find this also, by the way, with people who have dementia or Alzheimer's. It's just so frustrating and difficult to make that connection, right? And there, perhaps, before someone is fully enveloped in the Alzheimer's or the dementia, every now and then there's a flash of recognition, and that you can have a connection, and then it goes away in a blink of an eye, just like that, right? So those of us, people here nodding their heads, and those of you watching, you know what I mean. There are those times when you feel connected, and then there are those times that you just don't have a connection anymore. The same is true of people who are on the autism spectrum who are non-communicative. So, for example, Rabbi Brad Artson, a colleague of mine who is the dean of the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies out in Los Angeles, the conservative movement rabbinical school in Los Angeles, has twins, a boy and a girl. The girl is typical functioning. The son was low functioning autistic. And so, and forgive me if I say it wrong, it's supposed to be people first in describing people with disabilities. So in other words, you don't say disabled people, people with disabilities, people first language. So there's something controversial called a communication board that was developed, invented 10, 15 years ago. It was clear, Rabbi Artson's son Jacob exhibit that hand-flapping, going off on his own, kind of repetitive kind of behavior, could not talk. Still cannot talk today. But somehow his mother, Alana, was trained on this communication device, and Jacob now is able to talk on this device. Alana has to put her hand on top of Jacob's hand, and he types on this board and has been able to write very articulate, intelligent pieces of writing and speeches. So, when my wife Lenore worked for the Board of Jewish Education, or what later was the Partnership for Jewish Life and Learning, as their special educator, she ran a conference called Opening the Gates of Torah for people, for the entire community, to learn more about what it means to be disabled. And Rabbi Artson came to speak, and his son Jacob came with him, and Jacob spoke through this device, this speech that was really amazing. Now again, some people critique it, that perhaps because the hand of the parent has to be on top of the hand of the person who is autistic, that really it's the parent doing the writing. But Brad and Alana insist that it's their son Jacob writing, and has opened new worlds for him. Okay, so the idea is that trying to make that connection. So imagine until Jacob was able to communicate with this device. How frustrating it was for him to not be able to communicate to his parents, to his sister, and to others around him. And how he could be angry or violent, physically angry and violent in situations because being frustrated, not being able to communicate. And then once being able to find this communication device to be able to open Jacob's world, then there was a book also that came out recently called Life Animated by a journalist, Susskind, about his son, also severe autism, whose world opened up when the son was able to draw cartoons, Disney characters, and by drawing the Disney characters really well, and eventually going to Disney World and meeting people at Disney World, open up new worlds, and is able to then become educated and etc. So the frustration, so all of this to point out how frustrating and difficult it is to find that entree in to people who are on the autism spectrum, to make that connection, both a physical and emotional connection, to be able to say that I've reached you and they've reached us, to establish this connection. How much more so by extension does that make sense to apply that to God? We have no idea what God is. We picture God in our minds in a variety of ways. But doesn't it help in some way to understand that God perhaps is exhibiting autistic behaviors, and that might explain why it's difficult for us to make that connection, and how challenging it is for us to do that, and how frustrating, and we might give up because God doesn't answer, or we feel as if God doesn't answer? What if it means if God has this intellectual disability, or we imagine God with a disability, that it's all about trying, we need to try harder to make that connection. And that if we try hard enough, then perhaps we can feel like we've made that connection, and that this opens up new understandings then of God. So any thoughts or comments about this? So.
All right, so when you were describing this, all I thought about were fundamentalists. They could be fundamentalists of any religion.
Yes.
And like the ultra-Orthodox. Let's face it, conservative people think they're crazy. They're doing.
Okay.
You know, because it has to be this way. Like,
right.
The one that I always remember is, like, you have to eat, Passover, you have to eat your matzah over the floor. Because it might hit a drop of water.
Right, okay.
So, and they're taking the word literally.
Right.
Okay. And we don't think those people are crazy. I mean, they're different. We don't think of them as being autistic.
Right. Right. Okay. So what Saul's pointing out is perhaps the very strict fundamentalist behavior of the ultra-Orthodox. Or the ultra-Orthodox fundamentalists of any religion, that we think that they're crazy and how they are so strict about their laws. I'm not talking about that. Those strict behaviors are not, wouldn't be characterized as autistic, because they're not necessarily repetitive behaviors. It's just a very strict understanding of how something needs to be done in order to fulfill a particular commandment. So those who are not fundamentalist might be a little bit lax in performing it. So in other words, let's say lighting Friday night candles. So, we have 18 minutes when it says candle lighting on the Jewish calendar. Let's say this week candle lighting is at 5:30. I don't remember, but it's something like that. We have until 5:48 really to light candles. So we might take advantage of that time and maybe light candles at 5:47 because we're just within the 18-minute time frame. Or maybe we'd even be more lax than that and light after that. Okay, but in an ultra-Orthodox fundamentalist community, if candle lighting is this time, they might push it back more, because in Jerusalem that's the case. Jerusalem, the only place in the Jewish world where it's more than 18 minutes. to be sure of lighting the candles in time. And the siren goes off in Jerusalem to let you know that it's candle lighting time. And so, yes, the fundamentalist would be strict about doing it at that particular time, but you wouldn't say they're autistic in doing that. It's just that that's their definition of understanding God wants us to light the candles. Therefore, I'm going to do it in the most perfect, best way I can because that's what I think God wants. As opposed to, so an autistic, ultra-Orthodox fundamentalist Jew would light the candles. It would have to be the exact same kind of candles every single week. It would have to be in the very same candlesticks every week, and it has to be on the same place on the table or wherever you're lighting the candles. Whereas the ultra-Orthodox, it doesn't matter where in the house you light the candles, but someone with autism would need to do it the exact same way every single week. And the people standing around the fire have to be standing in their same place week after week. And mom has to do it the exact same way. I, as someone with autism, needs to stand here. And if I can't stand in that place, then I can't do it. So that there's a difference between exhibiting autistic behavior and exhibiting just ultra-Orthodox performance of the mitzvah. Other thoughts or Shaare?
So I might be able to relate to this better if we didn't call it autism or disability.
Okay, what would you call it then?
If you say that maybe people who are autistic are not disabled, but maybe thinking on a different plane. And
right.
Maybe God's on a different plane, and we're on this plane, and He's on
right.
this plane.
Yeah. So I see what you're saying. So
disability has this connotation.
Right. So Shaare is saying that disability has this connotation, and that it just kind of throws us off. It's negative, whatever. And certainly within the community of those with autism or community of anybody with any kind of disability, absolutely, they hate those terms because it makes it into us and them, and so that's and ultimately that doesn't get to the point that we're all together. So if you're going to characterize things as disability, you might hear on commercials. I forget what organization it's for, but differing abilities, whatever it is, it's yes. I get you that within the human community, we should get away from terms that distinguish people from one another. And now, if you apply it to God, that's not right. Okay, I hear you, I understand you, but and agree with you to some extent, but I think Dr. Orehorn-Prauser's point is that there's something illuminating about what we characterize as autism spectrum behavior and how we can apply that to God through these stories that are very challenging, troubling, and difficult stories in the Bible. And if we understand them as perhaps similar to a person who's on the autism spectrum, that perhaps then that highlights another richer layer to understanding God and how difficult it is to communicate with God. Because it's already difficult to communicate with God and feel the connection. And so if we add the extra layer that God is similar to a person with autism spectrum behaviors, then that makes it that much more difficult. So perhaps it's using the terminology and characteristics to apply it to an extra layer of understanding this abstract God that we're trying to communicate with. So I know I'm not explaining it in the best way. I hear what you're saying, Shaare, and yes, a part of me was and I think all of us who are taking Dr. Prauser's class had the same feeling about that. But I think it's just, again, it's using the characteristics to help us understand difficult passages in the Bible and to help us understand how difficult it is and challenging it is to communicate with God. Marie. Okay, yes, and then I think we need to conclude with this.
The first is that if you're looking at physical intellectual levels of ability. And you take the whole, nobody's perfect before God. It's just a
Right.
matter of what degree. And so everybody's got a disability before God. It's how you want to define it.
Right.
And describing it to God, I find extremely difficult. But that's,
Right.
take your point, and it's very well argued.
Understood.
The second thing is if you're talking about levels of intellect in terms of associating with or dealing with God, nobody, not even the most intelligent human or humans who have existed, can fully even understand God. And even the people
Right.
who have been closest to God, Moses, Abraham, have had communication problems, which we've seen, I believe, are mostly the human problems and not even so much God's problems.
Mm-hmm.
Not understanding, not trusting. These are human failings in a way that I perceive. And the third thing is, if you look beyond physical and just look at the souls, it really doesn't matter what anybody's physical attributes are. People with any level of disability may have the most beautiful soul. Somebody who's going to be a horrible person, or somebody who doesn't follow God, and then he's commanded not to do this, and they don't even do it.
Right.
Where's their soul? And so I think, you just kind of turning it around, disability is something that's really part of the entire human condition.
Yes.
On the physical, intellectual level, and the soul, I think, really extends beyond any physical, and that's really what's mentioned.
Mm-hmm. So, trying to summarize the 3 points that Marie said in case people couldn't hear the comments, that we're all exhibit some disability in some way. That the second point was that
nobody has an intellect that fully comprehends.
no one, no matter their intellectual capacity, can fully comprehend God. And the soul is really what it's about, and
there's no disability in a good soul.
And there's no disability in a good soul. Now, I agree with all of these points. I agree with all these points. The issue is that every religion tries to provide ways in which we can understand God so that we can connect to God. Okay? And so, by definition, then, it's going to be limited. All those explanations and all these characteristics that all religions try to define about God are all limited in nature just because human beings are doing it. And we have no idea, ultimately, what the infinite God is. So, all I'm suggesting on behalf of Dr. Prauser is that this is a new and radical, different, challenging way to understand, to add to the layer of understanding what God is. And I think it's powerful to attribute this kind of characteristic to God because what we see in human beings, so essentially everything that we describe God, creator, warrior, ruler, lawgiver, these are human characteristics. Human beings do these things, right? And so we see these powerful characteristics that human beings exhibit, and Albert Einstein, these essential, Martin Luther King, these kinds of people who come up in every generation, just saying the powerful, positive aspects of these people that have been used for good. Okay, every human being is weak and at fault and has faults. But I'm just saying the people who have exhibited powerful and have been powerful forces for change, if you just then apply those characteristics, you see those characteristics and apply them to God and know that there's plenty more characteristics that we can't even dream of. And so all Dr. Prauser is suggesting is that just as people with autism spectrum characteristics are, especially the higher functioning ones, exhibit very highly skilled and advanced layers of mathematics or music, etc., how much more so could we understand God that way, and how that just expands our knowledge and our appreciation of God, and therefore, by extension, our appreciation of people on the autism spectrum behavior that we encounter as well. So let's finish there because we've gone over time, and I just want to thank you for your interest in this topic, and just hope that we've all been challenged in some way by this.
Thank you.
Thank you.